quick announcements, and this was going to be my first announcement, is this is going to be a recorded meeting. So if just let you know if you want to turn your camera off, or just so that you're aware that we are doing that today. And I also want to start by welcoming you all and thanking you all for coming, and with acknowledgement that even though we're in cyberspace on Zoom, as we were just talking about, that UCR is on the homeland of the Cahuilla, Tongva, Lusano, and Serrano peoples, and we're grateful to be able to use this land and respect their ancestors, descendants, past, present, and future. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Amy Milne-Smith. And Amy Milne-Smith is joining us from Laurier University in Ontario, Canada, where it's 3 hours ahead. So it's afternoon for her. Well, it's still morning. So we're going to transition from morning to afternoon and join you in the afternoon shortly, Amy. And as we discuss today, we will hear much more about Amy's new research project. And she's an associate professor of history, and she's published 2 books. The first was London Clubland, A Cultural History of Gender and Class in Late Victorian Britain. And the second was Out of His Mind, Masculinity and Mental Illness in Victorian Britain. And that one just came out a few months ago. So congratulations on that, Amy. And today she's working on her new project, incorporating imperial spaces much more into her research. And she's going to be speaking to us from what I think is tentatively still called Before Shell Shock, Madness and Mental Health in the British Army, 1857 to 1914. And she's received support from the SSRC in Canada, which is kind of like an NEH grant here in the United States. So without further ado, it really gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Milne-Smith and to hear more about this exciting new research. So thank you for being here.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you for coming. I will get my screen share going here. Hopefully you will all be able to see this, and there we go. Working? Yes, all right, thank you. And thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me. So this is very new research, so you are the first audience to be hearing it, which has its advantages and disadvantages. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the kind of process of where I am and how I got to this place, and a bit of context, not so much about empire, which you guys are familiar with, but actually a little bit about medical history and about history of psychiatry and military history and the approaches that have been going on. So I'm going to start here with able seaman Charles C., a young man who arrived in India on the eve of the Indian Rebellion. He served for 12 months through the heart of the fighting in a naval brigade at Buxar in northern India. He was 20 years old at the start of his service, and according to all reports, did his duty quite well. He was successfully involved in some major action, but when the battle seemed to be calming down, he fell ill with a variety of vague symptoms and delusions. He was sent to hospital and then transferred to the Banipur Lunatic Asylum in Bengal in 1860. Like many patients, the cause of his illness was unclear. His comrades believed his mental troubles had started when he found out he had syphilis. The asylum superintendent said that Charles's symptoms were indicative of delirium tremens and diagnosed the young man as having suffered after heavy drinking. Another doctor noted he was suffering from malnutrition, as Charles had signs of emaciation and anemia, and identified that as the potential root of his illness. His symptoms, while he was in care, were quite distressing. He was terrified that he was going to be killed, and he was haunted by the voices of these would-be murderers. He tried to escape the asylum several times, and he also threatened suicide. What's perhaps most striking in Charles's medical records is that nowhere is there a discussion of Charles's specific war experiences, or the idea that his mental distress might have been caused by traumatic events. There's no mention of combat by his colleagues, nor did the doctors question that experience, even though he fought through the Indian Rebellion. This is common to servicemen admitted to British asylums in the 19th century, as I found in the first stage of my research. A report by the commissioners in lunacy in 1858 noted that soldiers were more likely to suffer from insanity than the general public. However, they did not connect this increase to any recognition of the horrors of war. Instead, a soldier was more likely to suffer insanity, as you can see here, because of accidents of service, changes of climate too frequently exposed him to these dangers. It was the general experience of imperial service, rather than any particularities of combat, that was identified as the risk factor here. Now, many scholars who've taken up the question of the psychological effects of war on Victorian soldiers have turned to methods of retrospective or posthumous diagnosis. Researchers try to kind of find a historical precursor of PTSD in the archives. Such work employs modern knowledge, methods, and disease classifications to the historical record. In the context of military mental health, there is absolutely a contemporary benefit to this process in order to demonstrate the long history of the mental trauma of soldiers. This can be a useful way to understand how military authorities have dealt with similar incidents in the past, to learn from mistakes and to shape best practices. And perhaps almost as importantly, to kind of find PTSD in the ranks of Napoleon's forces or the American Revolution also helps fight against false claims that today's soldiers somehow aren't as tough or as strong as those who served hundreds of years ago. And I think that that political significance isn't anything to be minimized. Some of the most thorough work in this vein has actually been done in relation to the American Civil War, where soldier's heart has been identified as a potential precursor to PTSD by a number of scholars. Cases of soldier's heart were first noticed in the summer of 1862 after the brutal fighting of the Peninsula Campaign. Soldiers suffered from shortness of breath and heart palpitations that didn't seem to have any other cause. Doctors at the time reasoned it was caused by knapsack straps or that were drawn too tightly across soldiers' chests, or heavy packs and extreme overexertion. It was all the backpacks. These men were treated in hospitals as if it was a physical disease. However, some historians have examined this supposedly novel physical disease and posited it might actually have been PTSD. The other, I think, more fascinating diagnosis retroactively linked to PTSD is nostalgia. In the 19th century, nostalgia is not a simple longing for earlier times. It is an official psychiatric diagnosis. During the Civil War, farm boys who had never been away from home more than a day were sent to battlefields without a chance to see family, often for years. Doctors at the time believed nostalgia was a state of despair and homesickness that was so intense, soldiers stopped eating, became listless, and some even died of nostalgia. But unlike soldier's heart, this disease was seen as psychological and caused by war trauma, or perhaps more specifically, kind of war displacement. In mild cases where the root cause was identified as a lack of willpower or moral turpitude, great Victorian expression, the recommended treatment was increased drilling, shaming soldiers, or simply throwing them back into combat as quickly as possible. In more severe cases, men were sent to asylums as well. Now, this kind of retrodiagnostic thinking of connecting nostalgia to PTSD has dominated historical scholarship on 19th century psychiatric diagnoses of war. There's also a very developed historiography on colonial psychiatry and asylums, but there isn't a lot in the actual kind of study of soldiers, British soldiers' mental health. The British field is pretty much dominated by Edgar Jones and Simon Wesley. Their work explores these massive samples from war pension files to examine this kind of long history of PTSD. And if you're looking back to our sailor Charles, you absolutely can find evidence he suffered from something maybe akin to PTSD. But when you look at those symptoms as recorded by Victorian doctors, you also see that he could have been suffering from malaria, syphilis, alcoholism, malnutrition. He could have had all of these things and more. The main issue when you rely on 19th century medical documents is you're never going to 100% know. And as someone who is trained as a cultural and gender historian, not in diagnostics, it's just not something that I want to attempt. Frankly, I think there are more interesting things to learn. So as a historian, I'm pretty deeply influenced by the work of scholars like Roy Porter and Charles Rosenberg, who caution against retrodiagnosis. They really emphasize how we are creatures shaped and formed by our societies. Charles Rosenberg writes that in some ways, disease does not exist until we have agreed that it does by perceiving, naming, and responding to it. Such a philosophy also reasons it's not possible to assume that a soldier who encountered war would react to it in the same way that soldiers do today. He might not have the same language to express his feelings. Not only are the wars radically different, so too are the soldiers. What intrigues me is less what illness such men had according to our diagnostic canon, but rather what they and their contemporaries believed could happen to men in war. So how did Charles' doctors, his friends, his family, and even Charles himself understand what went wrong in that moment of the Indian Rebellion and afterwards? This is the question that really has motivated my research. When one looks beyond retrodiagnosis, it opens up a much broader approach to understanding illness within its social and cultural contexts. So my research is motivated by the big picture question of how Victorians understood war's effect on men's bodies and minds, and what in turn were the implications that these conversations had on larger issues of empire and masculinity. So I'm inspired here by work like Markku Hakonen's recent piece looking at the crises of the mind in Malawi in the 1890s. Like myself, he's interested in looking beyond the institutions and diagnostics of colonial psychiatry, a very, very rich field. As Hakonen notes, British interest in colonial subjects' insanity helped prop up larger imperial projects. Yet there's less study of the mental illness of colonists themselves. Some recent work on topics like Anna Crozier's on tropical neurasthenia and Deb Neal's looking at manliness and malaria has been a great kind of corrective to the oversight, and I think it's a building field. But my purpose is to get even more specific, to not just look at madness and imperialism, but the specific connections between madness and colonial wars. So this is a rather roundabout way of getting at my research, but you're catching me at a particularly significant turning point in my thinking. So I began this project, as Jonathan noted, this kind of before shell shock project, wanting to seek out British medical and military authorities' understandings of the trauma of war. So the prehistory of shell shock. Instead of retrodiagnosis, I thought I would start with the soldiers that were deemed insane by medical experts at the time and then work backwards. Men like this fellow here, Captain Arthur Bissett of the Royal Dragoons. This is his case file in private lunatic asylum where he was sent. What I found in this research is that doctors just were not particularly interested in the ravages of war. Soldiers who ended up in asylum care were treated in relatively the same way as civilians. They were certainly more likely to have suffered sunstroke or exposures, but the doctors were not interested in probing the war experience beyond, as you can usually see in these early case notes, did they suffer sunstroke in India? Did they get syphilis? Were they a heavy drinker? What kind of soldier were they? Did they win the VC? But that's about it, character assessment, as opposed to really interrogating warfare itself. And in fact, most soldiers ended up being treated in the same institutions as civilians. There was no exploration of war trauma and mental breakdown. And this despite the fact that if you know anything about 19th century psychiatry, there was this whole railway spine thing going on at the time, which was all about interrogating the kind of psychological and physical effects of railway disasters. And so, you know, there was a link in the culture there that could have been made, was not being made in the military. So while I'm likely going to develop this kind of military asylum piece into a series of articles, it wasn't really providing me the kind of depth of material I was looking for. So I've had to rethink how to explore the cultural ideas of soldiers' breakdowns. Because there were absolutely social recognition and personal recognitions that battle could have a dramatic effect on the physical and mental well-being of men, both in the moment and afterwards. You just have to look kind of beyond the military medical archive. This conversation wasn't happening in asylum case books. It's happening in memoirs, in novels, in social investigations, in newspaper reports, in art. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is the result of this very recent kind of development in my research. I'm going to be exploring popular ideas of types of broken down soldiers and veterans in the public consciousness. And I thought a good place to start is with a large recognizable group that was at the forefront of conversations about traumatic war, the soldiers who fought in the Indian Rebellion. The Indian Rebellion was a large-scale, brutal, and defined conflict. It starts as a mutiny that spun out of control and was marked by ruthless violence. Christopher Herbert described it as a war of no pity in his book on the conflict of the same name, wherein he traces how the event created a kind of psychic wound on the Victorian imagination. I'm interested in looking at how individuals who fought in the conflict discussed and understood these kinds of wounds at the time themselves. I found it fascinating that in his preliminary note on sources in Andrew Ward's Our Bodies Are Scattered, he acknowledges some of the challenges of writing a thorough history of the Siege of Cawnpur, as many depositions, journals, and first-person accounts were contradictory or a bit muddled on specifics. For me, what was particularly fascinating is he has kind of a throwaway line that just these men were written by, quote, shell-shocked survivors with axes to grind. But of course, there was no idea of shell shock at the time, nor was there even an identification of a mental illness like nostalgia amongst British troops. The British Army never went in for nostalgia, it seems. I'm not quite sure why, but I have never seen that diagnosis, and even Wesley and Jones, who've been through tens of thousands of records, I think it came up once. So it's just not something that they chose to go to. But just because there wasn't an official military recognition of mental trauma as a major issue doesn't mean the subject wasn't discussed. And I found that soldiers engaged with the problems of the traumas of war in their personal reflections and recollections in a variety of ways. So diaries and memoirs of the Indian Rebellion were very popular. They were written during the war, in its immediate aftermath, and decades later. And a lot of these sources blur private and public memories. They reveal personal and collective ideas about wartime traumas. Letters and diaries were sometimes collected and published, and memoirs could be drafted both in the moment or written from memory decades later. Thus far, I think one of the most interesting things I found is there hasn't been a significant change over time how soldiers' breakdowns were discussed. However, it is something, of course, I'm looking for as my research continues. I've already read about a little over 20 memoirs and so far that were useful. I've read others that had nothing to say, of course, as these things go. Some men wrote exclusively on the rebellion, while career soldiers would often talk about their time in India as part of a much longer narrative of global service. And these narratives were highly influential in shaping the memory of the Indian Rebellion and giving it meaning. Memoirs clearly reveal that soldiers understood the war could be an exciting cause of both physical and mental breakdowns of various degrees. Thus, it's not surprising, as Roger Luckhurst explains in The Trauma Question, that the meaning of the word trauma has shifted significantly over time. In the mid-Victorian period, it was far more likely to be linked to physical injury than mental distress. And I actually think in my research going forward, I might just forego the term trauma because it is so much baggage today. I think because of its discourse and being caught up with post-traumatic stress, I think I might actually use the term breakdown, which I think maybe our understanding of the term now more captures Victorian understands that it could be a physical or mental, and that the distinguishment didn't necessarily matter. In the mid-Victorian period, trauma was much more likely to be linked to physical injuries than mental distress, in fact. What I'm going to outline today are some of the ways British soldiers perceived, named, and responded to the idea of soldiers' breakdowns in battle. Not a single source I've found as of yet describes a first-person account of such a breakdown. All in all, most accounts are pretty filled with bravery and stoicism, and yet descriptions of traumatic collapse do exist. And I've kind of noticed three major ways it was written about in diaries and memoirs of the rebellion. The first is the idea that war simply drained a man of his physical and mental powers. This could leave soldiers a kind of husk of their former selves and even could lead to death. The second type of representation are stories of mass panic or hysteria. So soldiers under intense strain could suddenly be gripped by paranoia and fear and become kind of temporarily insane or unhinged. And finally, there's the idea that a battle-hardened soldier could lose his mind and engage in violence outside of the boundaries of war. So he would have a temporary break and unleash the violence that was acceptable in war onto people who were outside of the battle. This is my first attempt to set down and make sense of these soldiers' descriptions of their own war service on their own terms. You'll see these descriptions of breakdowns don't fall neatly into physical or psychological breaks. They were often buried in the midst of much longer discussions of heroism, jingoism, and bravery. But these are moments of anxiety, the kind of dark shadow of the imperial splendor. But this stereotype of the British stiff upper lip is on full display in many memoirs and diaries of the rebellion. In his memoir published in 1907, Owen Tudor Byrne writes about the Indian conflict as one part of his lengthy military career, which he characterizes as one of service and duty. He's commissioned in 1855 and served for a few months on the Isle of Wight before going and joining his regiment in the Crimea. He served in the tail end of the war before returning home for a year, and then he was off to the Indian Rebellion. He was first sent to Oud, where he was engaged in a few serious battles before he joined Sir Colin Campbell's army besieging Lucknow. He's nominated for a Victoria Cross for a dangerous reconnaissance mission where he not only succeeded, but rallied some severely shaken troops to their duty. He was part of heavy fighting until they finally won back Lucknow. He's mentioned several times in dispatches. He got a medal with clasp. And his description of the war experience is exactly the kind might anticipate of a high Victorian soldier hero. He explains he never feared death, nor did any of his near-death experiences affect, quote, his nerves in any way. The closest he gets to admitting any darker side to his military experiences is in describing the Indian Rebellion. He admits that war and killing is a, quote, particularly disagreeable duty. Most men only briefly engage with the horrors of war and death in their recollections. Anthony Dixon Home was a surgeon for the 90th Foot when his unit was called to aid in the rebellion. He was at the relief of Lucknow and was awarded the Victoria Cross for defending wounded troops. He was left in charge of a group of casualties who got cut off from their main column. They set up in a small house to defend themselves. The Indian troops then set fire to the house, and Home had to retreat with his casualties to a small shed. There were 6 men to defend the wounded, and they held out for 22 hours until they were finally relieved. Now, for Home, we have his actual diary, and reading it, he doesn't indulge much in how harrowing this experience it was for him. I only learned these details looking at his Victoria Cross commendation. Doesn't mention them in his diary. To be fair, he was busy. Without glossing over the horrors of war, he doesn't dwell on them, though. In fact, after surviving the siege of Lucknow, he writes, "While it's good to appreciate the victory, he was too busy to, quote, indulge in any feelings." I think this is the narrative of war and empire the British wanted the norm to be. The empire is, in these versions of events, a noble endeavor, and while the British are willing to fight for it, it's done out of sense of duty and responsibility. The Indian conflict was a mutiny, and the ungrateful sepoys had to be punished for their disobedience. One finds this narrative repeated over and over again. Joan Hitchberger notes soldier heroes in the 19th century were used for didactic purposes, usually pointing out some kind of admirable quality. The military made great efforts across the second half of the 19th century to improve the reputation of the army and kind of glamorize its efforts. This stretched beyond long-standing valorizations of officers to even the everyday soldier. but the results were mixed at best, as in real life, the working classes still largely saw the army as the resort of the desperate and the violent. For the officer class, however, their stories were absolutely part of a long-standing tradition of military myth-making. And before I move on, I do think it's important to underscore that not all men felt horror or displeasure at the brutality of war. While public narratives like to portray the vicious violence perpetrated on rebellious Indians as some grim duty to be performed, others clearly relished this violence. In Robert Montgomery Martin's account of the mutiny published in 1858, he is unrelenting in his criticism of the imperial policy that led to the violence and quotes at length from sources that prove the brutal side of the conflict. He quotes a letter supposedly published in the Bombay Telegraph, then reprinted across a number of Indian and English papers. Though I actually haven't found this letter reprinted the way he says it was, though variations of it, but the exact language not quite. So after a grueling recapture of Delhi, there were thousands of rebel soldiers who were executed. This letter writer describes in detail the city on September 21st, 1857, when it was cleared of mutineers. After that, though, the army continued its slaughter. Quote, all the city's people found within the walls of the city of Delhi when our troops entered were bayoneted on the spot. And the number was considerable, as you may suppose, when I tell you that in some houses, 40 and 50 people were hiding. These were not mutineers, but residents of the city who trusted to our well-known mild rule for pardon. I am glad to say they were disappointed. The letter claims that the British decision not to harm women and children is the actual mistake that was made. So he's in favor of slaughtering the mutineers and all the people in the city, but he says, because we didn't harm women and children, this is a mistake because, of course, these are, quote, not human beings, but fiends, or at best, wild beasts, deserving only the deaths of dogs. So in this case, the only criticism is the British weren't brutal enough in their reprisals. And this certainly reflects a broad feeling that to many, killing in warfare was just. And in fact, many men also didn't seem to mind doing so. And I think it's a mistake if we kind of project the idea that our modern sensibilities of war and killing are probably just not the same as the Victorians, nor frankly are the traumas of killing as universal today as perhaps sometimes we make it seem. I want to start unpacking some soldier breakdowns with memoirs of Charles Alexander Gordon, where he wrote about 39 years service in the British Army. He frankly acknowledged a life in service was more dangerous than civilian life. And while death in battle is the most obvious risk, he also affirmed what most military medical men recognize, that service could somehow just use a man up. On his way home after the Indian Rebellion, Gordon notes that many men survived the war only to die immediately afterwards. He reasons that many suffered exposure and excessive fatigue, and that when the fighting was done, their bodies just gave out. Yet he also wondered if, quote, perhaps the incidents of that service had to some extent affected the feelings hereto so often manifested by soldiers in presence of death among their comrades. Gordon acknowledges the emotional drain of a conflict, such as the Indian Rebellion, seeing colleagues and friends die around you. Recognition of the short and long-term effects of war on the British soldiers present across a number of diaries and memoirs. Soldiers made little effort to differentiate between these psychological and physical damages of war. And as one can see from Gordon's account, the two were often interrelated. There's no recognition of a disease like nostalgia amongst the British military medical establishment, but there was recognition by memoirists that the emotional trauma of war could be devastating. A.E. Osborne wrote that when he first heard of a mutiny, he was traveling. He was shocked to find out his old regiment was one of the first to rise up. He wrote that, quote, the bitterness, the shame drove me mad. Now, it's easy to dismiss this as simple hyperbole, except a few pages later, Osborne writes that a good friend of his had, in fact, died of a broken heart. He tracks the origin of the man's illness to the day he heard about the mutineering soldiers of his own unit. As a man who devoted himself to his sepoy regiment, the officer could not overcome a sense of disgrace and betrayal, at least according to how Osborne understood it. There's a real sense from some memoirs that men could simply only be pushed to their limits before something had to give. In the case of a Captain Waterman, his fellow officers believed he suffered a mental collapse due to one too many horrific shocks to his system. The memoir writer doesn't mention if it was a physical or a mental shock, and again, distinguishing doesn't seem particularly important to them. It's these kinds of reflections that reveal deep anxieties embedded within the bravado of imperial war. Sometimes it wasn't even the most dangerous battle that produced the greatest mental strain, but rather the uncertainties of war, the kind of near misses and the nervous waiting. Julius Medley was an engineer, and most of his memoir focused on the technical elements of fighting a war. Yet even he briefly describes the crippling anxiety that could arise from a combination of bad news about the war and uncertainty about what was happening in other areas of the country. He writes, "That was indeed a fearful time of anxiety, and none who passed through it can ever forget it." Another memoir describes a man who suffered a severe shock after a near-death experience, and the next day he simply fell apart. As the author explains, "Anxiety has been known to attenuate with marvelous rapidity the most robust frame, but seldom has the malady known by physicians as timor irrationalis produced a more complete absorption, or rather abstraction, of the whole corporeal system than in the present instance. The only solace to this man falling apart is that he wasn't a British regular, but rather drawn from a voluntary company of old pensioners and Eurasians." But there are examples in memoirs that even the most senior officer and dedicated soldiers could break down under enough strain. General Stalker had been left in command of troops at Bashir. He was convinced, however, that he didn't have enough men or guns to successfully defend his positions. Rumors spread that the responsibility of his doomed mission was too much for him to bear, and he shot himself. In his published letters, George Digby Barker explained that after Stalker's death, a general panic almost seems to have taken place here. Memoirs of the rebellion are part of a broader cultural representation of the conflict that became increasingly more positive over time. So early sympathies for the sepoy troops dissipated in the aftermath of the violent deaths of women and children at Cawnpore. Reimaginings of the rebellion placed the British soldiers as the universal heroes, defending against the ultimate betrayal. However, of course, as Sebastian Pendar notes, these commemorations could sometimes belie, but never efface, the terrifying memories of violence and bloodshed that animated them. While the British tried to reassure its citizens about the strength of the empire, colonists increasingly developed a siege mentality. As Pender and other scholars increasingly note, such stories of anxiety are key to understanding the complexity of the imperial project. So this is in line with the kind of trouble with empire that Antoinette Burton speaks about in her recent book. Even the most jingoistic memoirs acknowledge the dangers of service to the British soldier. Such stories heighten the bravery of men who do survive unscathed, but they also reveal uncertainties. Perhaps some of the most dangerous and damaging stories are those of mass hysteria that could spread amongst groups of soldiers in particularly hairy moments of war. In Garnet J. Woolsey's The Story of a Soldier's Life, he reflects numerous times on the nature of courage and how some men could be broken by war. Woolsey's story of a soldiering life is very high on the stiff upper lip, yet even he could admit that the rigors and anxiety of war could lead to temporary or more serious mental breakdowns. Woolsey described a peculiar phenomenon of war where soldiers were periodically seized by a senseless panic, though he's sure to make note such things rarely spread to commissioned officers. The idea of mass panic and hysteria is a phenomenon recognized across a number of memoirs. Another veteran of the rebellion recounts a terrifying moment when he and other soldiers and civilians were trapped in a building on fire with sepoy troops outside. He describes in vivid detail how the men, women, and children were terrified for their lives, convinced of the fact they were going to be burnt alive. In that moment, he describes there was, quote, a wild excitement on the men when brought out by the fighting, which made them, as you may say, half drunk. The idea that intense fighting or terror could temporarily make men lose their minds was a pretty common refrain. Such stories are even found in diaries. So our surgeon, Dr. Home, explains how panic could envelop a group of men. One night after heavy rains had washed out the tents, the troops were all on a high alert. And for some reason, a kind of panic seemed to seize them for no specific cause. The men believed the sepoys were attacking, and in fact, British troops ended up firing on each other. 5 men were wounded, and one wonders how many more were shaken by these events. Made Home wonder if, quote, chaos has come again. In this instant, Home clearly outlines the danger of such moments of collective madness. Not only could the enemy take advantage, but troops could turn on each other, and the vulnerability and terror of these moments is pretty acute. The traumas of war could also take a dangerous turn in a shameless plug for my recent book. I'll mention one of the central points I discovered in studying medical and popular ideas of men and madness in 19th century Britain is associations between men and madness often centered on the idea of violence and self-control. Men's essential nature was understood as violent, and when a man's self-control was destroyed by physical illness or mental breakdown, his kind of natural bestial nature could be revealed. And these incidents in many ways aren't just limited to, spectacular crimes in the British metropole, but I think they find very rich expression within the colonial context, where soldiers are supposed to some level, tap into this violent nature, and yet, of course, had to control it. And it's a much finer balance. Soldiers themselves believe the traumas of war could trigger violent, uncontrollable outbursts. One veteran soldier recalled a terrifying incident in the heart of the rebellion when a soldier woke in the night and began strangling his tent mate for no particular reason. The whole camp was roused as they struggled, and finally the victim had to club the delusional man over the head with the butt of his rifle. War not only unleashed, but often relied on men's more violent nature and required him to tap into this. But soldiers were certainly keenly aware it isn't always possible to control the violence once unleashed. William Ford Mitchell's account of the uprising was remarkably frank and quite open about the horrors of war and how it could change a man. He recounts a moment in the rebellion when he narrowly avoids a booby trap. And while in the moment he considered himself lucky, he says that even decades later, he dreams about this close call. And he relates that it was quite common that soldiers were plagued by nightmares of the war, even years after the events. But in perhaps his most terrifying story, he tells about the complete mental breakdown of James Walker. After learning about the death of a friend at Secundra Bog, Walker flew into a violent rage. Walker shot a woman for no reason and then broke down crying. Ford Mitchell explains the man was not in his right mind, but rather he was, quote, like one of the Furies, if there are male Furies, plainly seeking death, but not meeting it. As scholars note, soldiering is increasingly posited as a positive corrective for the sedentary, effeminizing life of many middle and upper class Brits. It was in war that a man could prove his courage and his manhood. Yet the danger of soldiering was that the experience could push men beyond the ideal to another extreme. A soldier could turn into a beast and a savage. And in fact, the experience of battle was described as a moment of kind of authorized savagery. The key was for a man to be able to bring himself back from the brink. So Lieutenant Vivian Magendi's well-known memoir, Up Amongst the Pandies, or 7 Years Service in India, is a well-known account for its vivid and uncompromising descriptions of battle. It's also revealing of explorations of the boundaries of violence. In one of the most intense descriptions of fighting in the jungle, he acknowledges violence men might dole out in war doesn't always sit well with their peacetime selves. At one moment, he gives an enthusiastic, wild account of what fighting was like. Hark to that cheer, a wild tally-ho. What is this then, fox hunting? No, but not unlike it, only more madly and terribly exciting ever than that. It is man-hunting, my friend. He gives a detailed description of a man shooting and bayoneting a mutineer right in front of him. And then on the very next page, he writes, it's horrid work at the best. But that, though, comes afterwards, and not now, when mad with excitement, your pulse beating quickly, and I fear me, glad at the work of death, as the veriest butcher amongst them, you press forward amid smoke and noise and crackling rifles and burning houses and burning jungle through an atmosphere thick with sulfurous smells and choking dust and heavy heat, while the scenes which I have just attempted to describe are going on in all their licensed fury on either side. Magendie is very conscious that in writing of these events, he feels sick, but that in the moment, the excitement of battle was able to, according to him, deaden one's sensibilities and draw such a film of callousness and indifference over one's eyes. In retrospect, he can now shudder as he thinks of the scenes which he then beheld unmoved, and almost doubt as he recalls the bloody tragedies in which he actively, nay willingly, took part. He finished writing this when this memory was pretty fresh in 1859, and yet even then the difference between feelings in the moment and in the aftermath were apparent. He was trying to divide these selves. Soldiers had been able to unleash their violent bestial natures and in a moment restrain them. The natural feelings of ferocity in the heart of battle should just as naturally cause some horror in peacetime. It's no surprise these delicate personal experiences pushing the boundaries of civility and self-control played on larger anxieties of the imperial project. One can debate the influence of empire on everyday Britain's lives, but it's at the heart of the experience of the 19th century soldier. I think when you start looking for it, this kind of tension and anxiety is at the heart of the imperial project and evident even in its most bellicose supporters, which brings me to Kipling's most famous and overused poem. I always think it's strange the way this poem is used by like Christian homeschoolers today, very popular amongst Christian homeschoolers, to kind of celebrate jingoistic aspirations of nationhood, because it's an incredibly anxiety-filled poem. The very title is pointing to how British manhood is an ephemeral goal that had to be constantly earned and proved. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. I mean, how many soldiers actually found they could always force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve you your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there's nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. And if they did, what was the cost of that, both mental and physical? Which brings me to this kind of central question motivating my research at the moment. When we take out retrodiagnosis, how did the British engage with the ideas of physical and emotional toils of war? How did this influence the imperial project? And how did everyday Britons engage with the idea of the soldier and the veteran? In this work, I'm in kind of direct conversation with the now classic works like Graham Dawson's Soldier Heroes, and exciting new research such as that in Brown, Berry, and Bagadia's recent edited collection, Martial Masculinities. This work emphasizes the centrality of the military, the cultures of war and masculinity, and how these experiences and representations shaped Victorian and Edwardian personal and national identities. In large part, these questions have been best explored, I think, so far by literary scholars, from Christopher Herbert to Emma Butcher to Holly Furno, Laura Kriegel. And I think it's just about time that gender and cultural historians start to add our 2 cents to the story. This project is still in its very early stages, as you can see. I'm happy to see it develop according to the sources I'm discovering. And I think in trying to kind of relieve myself of the burden of trying to find mental trauma as we would understand it without using retrodiagnosis, it's allowed me to really keep myself open to understanding Victorians on their own terms. So my path forward is looking to how some of the most common representations of soldier breakdowns make their way into public consciousness, whether explorations of the veterans who were haunted by war, those who found themselves unable to find a place at home when back in Britain. I basically want to look at how soldiers, both from their own points of view and in Victorian popular culture, were understood, in particular, when they broke down. And so with that, I want to thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'll clap out loud. I've tried to do the out loud clap before with everyone unmuting, but it doesn't work as well as you think, but I'll do it alone. And I really appreciate you bringing this very early stages research to us, that formative stage. It's a really exciting time in thinking about a project. And I really also enjoyed and found helpful listening to you describe that process and how you're kind of building through it and how the project is changing in front of you. And I think it's always really helpful to hear other people going through that experience. I know we've got grad students here with us today, but it's a process that continues. At grad school, you feel it very much, and then it continues, that kind of process of learning about your project as you create it. So it's really, really great to hear that, and exciting to hear sort of the ground floor of the research. So I want to just open the floor up now for questions. So please just raise your hand if you have a question. And great, there are already questions appearing rapidly. So Friba, Professor Zirmov, I think I saw your hand come up first, and then Mark, you can take over after we give Professor Milne-Smith a chance to respond.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It's very daring on your part, I think, to sort of question the impact of warfare on average people, on soldiers in the 19th century, which is really a period of imperialism and a great deal of violence. And I think your research is so relevant to what's going on today, to our own involvement, in the Middle East, soldiers who came back from Iraq. We never talk about these guys, but they suffered, plenty. So I think, again, kudos to that research, and I think also, a history of, kind of medical history, with in Great Britain. So I think, it touches on so many fields. So I'm really grateful. So, and it also brings to my mind, the big rebellion that took place in Egypt, in Cairo, when Napoleon's troops invaded to take, Egypt before the British got there. And then the subsequent war between, the two powers. So that was the first sort of imperial involvement. And then the kind of mass killing of the rebels in Egypt, in Cairo, which turned a lot of opinions against Napoleon, because there were people who favored Napoleon, but that just, turned, and it was just incredible that at the wake of the French Revolution, for the cause of the empire, Napoleon was willing to kill so.
I'm sorry.
Frozen. Yeah, I don't know if Friba can hear us. Unfortunately, we can't hear you, Friba. Right as you were building the question, I'm afraid. So what I think we'll do is just give her a few seconds to see if she unfreezes, and then we'll just turn to Mark, and we can double back around to Friba. But let's give her just 1 or 2 seconds to see if she.
Sometimes when I turn my camera off, it unfreezes me. Oh no. Or in the chat, right? I do have the chat function. Oh,
okay. Now if you just unmute, there you are.
Yes. So I just was wondering if you can sort of also include Indian accounts of that rebellion and atrocities that were committed, because I think bringing the two, perspectives into play would really help, your work, and then would widen your audience.
Yes. The problem is there aren't many. And the ones that exist, there have been, from my readings, very significant speculation about whether they are real, or if they are either completely fabricated or kind of composites of perhaps people who did not go along with the rebellion and were sympathetic to the British. From the reading that I've done, and I will trust my much more well-read scholars of the specific Indian rebellion, it's something that they mention again and again, is like, it's amazing that we do not have great accounts of Indians writing back against this. I think, though, in this project, I am going to do other British wars, so I think that might be something I can find at other instances. But thus far, yes, it's. I should mention, just because I see that she's here, Caitlin is one of the group of a team of students. Luckily, this funding, what it allowed me to do is be very ambitious with my research. And so I've gone in multiple directions. I've been looking at memoirs and court martials and government accounts and psychiatric and medical accounts, trying to get at these questions, which is amazing to do that kind of scouting research that we just usually can't do. But yes, that's thus far, I don't have that for this account, but I am, You get it more with the Crimean War, and you get it with some of the later conflicts. So I think that would be interesting to see what happens to narratives when you do get more two-sided accounts of, pretty brutal warfare. The idea of, I mean, of course, amongst scholars, we know that the 19th century was not a peaceful time. And yet in the pop culture, it still is this idea of, oh, these little wars. They were not little. They were they were large, and they were violent, and they were very bloody. And I think that's it's interesting to see. For my mind, I'm having to kind of sort through the weeds, but it's there. There is a recognition that these are horrific. Even people who support it are having moments of change and horror. So thank you for that.
Mark, and then it looks like Padma and Clayton. So let's, Mark, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Milne-Smith, for coming and talking to us today. This was really, really fascinating. I wrote a paper for the CIS last year, which was also titled Before Shell Shock, which was kind of a comparison between the Americans in Cuba and the British in South Africa. So I'm sort of tracing a similar path. I'm sort of right here with you. So I apologize if I have questions that are a little kind of inside baseball on it, but I was really interested in this idea of a kind of cultural and temporal sort of specificity to expressions of emotion and breakdowns and things like that, and sort of writing against the kind of universalism that often gets ascribed to things like, looking for PTSD in the past, right? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about balancing these accounts where you're taking them on their own terms, and yet also having to kind of read against the sort of Victorian stiff upper lip grain, kind of striking that balance between trying to listen to them and trying to see through that kind of emotional firewall that they're putting up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating prehistory. I don't know if you're familiar with my colleague Mark Humphrey's work. He wrote a book called A Weary War, looking at shell shock, and his first chapter is a masterful pre-1914 discussion of the things that lead up, concept of neurasthenia. Of course, the doctors who served in the First World War were trained by the Edwardian and late Victorian armies. And so where did these ideas all come from? So we kind of have had great conversations about these earlier histories and how do you read these records? The great thing about memoirs is they are a crafted source. They are written for a public audience. And so they absolutely are self-reflective and artificial in some ways. This is the story they want to tell. And I think it is important that I do try to acknowledge that what I am doing is finding not even the B story, the C stories, right? And I want to unpack that from even these magisterial, most forward-facing, positivistic representations of empire, which I think has been a big trend in British imperial history lately, is looking at anxieties, and to find anxieties, you usually do have to look at subtext and not just main text. And I think that I'm lucky in the sense that it's one part of what I'm looking at, because while those military accounts don't dig into the meaning of soldiers' experiences, they still sometimes record them. I mean, the fact that they record the nightmares, they record what the delusions were of being stabbed in the night, that these men who you can say that men who are in these asylums have, without retrodiagnosing them, clearly are not able to live in the world. And I don't know what is wrong with them, but they are suffering extreme forms of mental distress. So they don't have those boundaries. They don't have the ability to kind of filter and tell the story people want to hear from them. and so it's the kind of, those are the two extremes of the sources I have. People are very self-aware, very trying to put on this mask. And then you have these completely maskless people who are showing more than they want to. And then I want to, because I am a crazy person and I always take on way too much, I want to connect all that through experiences of actual veterans. What happens when they come home beyond just the parades and the memoirs, like the fact that they collect the survivors of the Indian Mutiny in like 1902, and they want to celebrate and fet these men. And there's this very famous photo of them that you often see represented. But in the finding of that photo, a number of those men were in workhouses. So what does that tell you about how you actually are treating these veterans? You know, that these heroes of imperial war, we're digging them up, but we don't actually treat them very well. You know, that's like the missing piece of the actual experience of soldiers. When you have social investigators talking about veterans, they talk about like different types of veterans, and they talk about the different type of beggar veterans, and that there's subcategories within those that they were recognizing as particular kind of problematic figures. So how does that, you know, that figure with the heroic figures, you know, is it just about class? Is it just about, you know, those who managed to find a place for themselves back in Britain? I think it's all part of the military story that I want to tell. I just haven't picked them all through yet. But I think they're all important parts of that story. And if you just focus on one, I think you miss kind of this fuller picture. And yes, this is early stages, so that's why I'm still kind of speculating, but hopefully that kind of got to some of the questions you were asking about.
Padma, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fascinating. And I did have a question. I know this is very new, just about the parameters of the project, because I feel like it is so rich. I can see it going in potentially so many different directions. And this is, again, partly because I'm a literary scholar. So this question of genre for me is particularly interesting. The idea of what memoir is and the kind of always sort of quasi-fictionality of memoir. And so I have a couple of questions. I'll try to make them brief. One is back to this question of memoir, different kinds of memoir. And I asked this question because I've read captivity memoirs written in the 1790s, people who were captured by Tipu Sultan specifically, and then write about their trauma, particularly soldiers who were castrated or made to dress up as dancing girls, right? So there's an interesting question about the kind of what memoir is attempting to do, right? Or the kind of memoir that it's the kind of message that the memoir is trying to get across, either, you know, depending on when this is, you know, before Tipu's defeat in 1799, certain kind of memoir vis-a-vis, you know, after that, when the sort of captivity memoir obviously has much less purchase. And which brings me to my second question. I recently taught Mary Seacole memoirs in a class of mine, and I was curious if and I don't even know if this exists in the context of the 57 Sepoy Mutiny Rebellion thing, whether we have accounts from nurses or, you know, other people who were involved in the kind of apparatus of military operations, but who were themselves not soldiers. So that's just a second question. And then my third thing is, I guess it's not so much of it's a question plus a plug, but I think what's interesting to me about this discussion of this absence of trauma in memoirs is that it is so palpable in literature. There's so much fictional writing about the trauma of war and imperial conflict. And, you know, when you were talking about this absence, the first thing that I thought of, which is not a Victorian example, but is Wordsworth's description of a kind of traumatized military vet in the prelude, right, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolutionary Wars. So it is, I don't know how much, you know, historians generally include literature, as again, it's literary scholars, this is new, it's unfamiliar territory to me, but that the way in which again, and as many people know, the literature around the rebellion is so rich with descriptions of trauma. This is just fascinating, and I was curious about that, its role in your project. Anyway, thank you.
So I'll start with the fiction. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool cultural historian, so I use fiction all the time. I'm making my way through some of the rebellion fiction, a lot of written by women, really interesting. And the rebellion fiction is quite fascinating because there's about, I think, 60 novels written about the rebellion between it and the end of the century. And some of them, of course, are written by people who actually had experiences, that they were there or they were there right after. And of course, some of it is just absolute speculation that I have no connection to it at all, kind of romantic empire dramas. So that is another layer of the research that I'm going to be adding to it. Because, of course, the line between fiction and memoir is always a murky one. And I think in this topic, even more so. Where you have people who survived and then wrote fiction about it, or who had relatives who survived, so it's all, I am fascinated by genre. Historians, I think we're getting better about paying attention to things like that. We don't have the expertise, but we at least can rely on our literary scholar friends who do, to think through the different manifestations of stories and how sometimes there is allowance for explorations of trauma within certain contexts, whereas in others there is not. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised that there wasn't room, according to the military, for an exploration of mental trauma. There wasn't space for it. They were dealing with cholera and malaria, and I think that you're not going to find it, and I just had to give up on this. But realistically, people who were suffering psychological breakdowns were probably going to be finding them in court-martial records rather than in, these kind of explorations. But they're never going to say that. They're going to say they were a coward and we shot them. So there's, we might want to, it's like the allure of the retrodiagnosis. It's so tempting, but it's like, oh, but there's not, you can't quite make that, that connection. In terms of women, nursing, no, I don't know of any nurse memoirs, but absolutely women writing through their experience of siege. That absolutely happens. Sometimes in the form of memoir or letters, sometimes in the form of fiction. In particular, you get a lot of these very high profile siege. The stories of women are more compelling, right? Because this is how it's all sold back home and exploited back home. And if we're to believe some of the sources, that literal soldiers were going into battle saying, remember Cawnpur, remember the ladies of Cawnpur. So that women were absolutely present, both as physical actors, as victims of violence, both Indian and British women, and as observers caught up in it all. So thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, Uttarapan, please go ahead.
Hi, very fascinating project. My question relates to the point you made earlier about, this intention to corral together as much of a play of perspective as possible. And I was wondering the extent to which oral narratives might play into the sources that, provide those perspectives. So I'm thinking here of a different context of writing. So the Nigerian Civil War, for example, the extensive trauma recent research showed seeped into oral narratives. So oral narratives about hunger and starvation, for example, become a way in which those memories get translated to subsequent generations, because they were so traumatic they could not be processed by these communities. And also there was no scriptural infrastructure, they could not write. So I was wondering the extent to which oral narratives might or might not introduce an added perspective of sources for these other more or less indigenous viewpoints where they did not have a lot of textual information to present.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I know some scholars have done some work with looking at some kind of some of the official government reports afterwards, where they were interviewing local people and there were things recorded. But in terms of the longer oral history of the rebellion within India, that is its own thing, in the sense that it's something that I am neither qualified nor able to do. It is basically has become the big historiographical divide that I am not engaging with is, was this the first war of Indian independence? That's where a lot of those conversations have been around. I get the feeling that of understanding and unpacking the sepoys who rebelled, and more so non-sepoys, non-soldiers who joined the rebellion, who made it more than a mutiny. Why did they do it? Did they do it as an explicitly anti-colonial act? Or was it about regional dissatisfaction? Was it about, for some people, it was about reinstalling the emperor. For some, it was about local kind of disputes of land and taxes. And that seems to be where I think those oral histories have been studied, is about understanding what is the legacy of the rebellion within India. What does it mean to India? And that's why, you know, when you're talking about this topic, what to call it is so difficult. That's why I chose rebellion, because that seems like the most neutral of recognizing what it was without trying to either invalidate its politics or put politics on it. But I think that that's perhaps where that strain has gone in the literature, which is, you know, the historian nerd in me loves that, because it's such a historiographical, fascinating trail to follow, how that has evolved. So thank you for that.
Heidi.
Hi, thank you so much. I really found so much of interest in your presentation, and I'm very interested in this conversation as it's developing too, sort of building on Fariba's and Padma's and Yuti's comments about, you know, trying to get at the other perspectives, right, that might be represented in ways that are not, you know, obvious, I guess, or have not been, you know, obvious, trying to find those other sources. My question is actually, though, about the possible differences, question mark, if there are any, among the different kinds of traumas, or I guess breakdowns, that were experienced by the soldiers, but then also sort of the caretakers. We talked about this a little bit with the idea of the nurses or the medical caretakers, and maybe this is coming out of, you know, these past years of COVID, where we're beginning to understand the traumas faced by the medical people who take care of us, and who have had their own, you know, PTSD or whatever you want to call it, their own traumas, you know. And then just yesterday, I was listening to National Public Radio, and they were interviewing a surgeon who was at the hospital in San Antonio when they started bringing in children from the most recent, or not the most recent, but the mass shooting of last week in Uvalde, Texas. And this surgeon, who has decades and decades of experience dealing specifically with assault weapon injuries, broke down. And I think that is exactly the word to use on the radio, and began crying. And so it just made me think, so this is kind of fresh in my memory when I'm thinking about, you know, the medical staff who were you know, forced to deal with, as you're pointing out, these very bloody kind of horrific injuries. And I noticed that one of your sources was entitled The Diary of a Medical Officer. And so I just wondered if there were kind of different kinds of breakdowns, or different, you know, ways of looking at like how breakdowns might be experienced by the soldiers who are in the field, but then also by the ones who, you know, must receive them and try to care for them. Anyway, kind of a long question, but if you have any thoughts on that, I'd be very interested.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think the rebellion is one of these moments where I love when they talk about home fronts and battlefronts as if it's, you know, in total war, as if it's a new thing in the 20th century. And it's like, well, no, like this is a war where there wasn't a distinguishment from people who were living through it. If you were in one of the cities, you were in it. You were there. It didn't matter if you were a combatant or not. You were in this warfare. Home, the surgeon whose handwritten diary I've looked at, is a fascinating source, because the one time he kind of talks personally about almost breaking down is when he was having to amputate multiple limbs without anesthetic. And he talks about how, this is horrible. This is, it's a diary, so it is brief, but he basically says, I don't know how they go through it. This is awful. And he kind of just tails off. But, it's a short but very visceral exploration of, very brutal battlefield medicine, where you basically are just, sawing off limbs, hoping they survive, watching people slowly die in your care, when you have basically nothing to offer them. I'm always amazed at the 19th century medical toolkit is basically saws and drugs, basically opium derivatives. They didn't have much, and to see people constantly dying under their care, I think it does weigh on them in ways that they sometimes will acknowledge. It's a good point to see if I can find more from the medical, because this is, this isn't the high trained medical staff. Like, there's no psychiatrists in the British Army in the 1850s. These are surgeons mainly. This is not a high prestige or high profile profession, but I would be curious if there are any other memoirs of kind of on the ground surgeons, as opposed to just the high medical staff, which those memoirs have not been particularly useful, because I think they were too separate. I mean, when you're just basically sending rations around and sending people around, you don't have that immediacy of war. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, maybe we'll wait to see if there's any other questions. I'll ask a few, and one of them is the classic historian's question, which is why 1857? Why do you start it now? And some of the questions come up. Pavan was gesturing back towards the 1790s and so on. And so is there some particular thing that makes this the right time to start? That's one question. And another question that I think you alluded to a little bit, but I wonder how much more you could do with is the racial dynamic and what it. So for some of these men, I can imagine that killing non-white people was culturally and psychologically easier. But some of your accounts also suggest, and they could suggest an undermining of that racial system, in that other men clearly did break down, even though, it wasn't like it was hunting people, and that wasn't okay. They were people, that there was a recognition that, yes, they're not white, but they're people too. Like, and so I wonder how much you see that conflict between the kind of racist doctrine of the British Empire and people's experiences in killing people, and kind of recognizing that it's that moment may make them recognize that that people are, Depeche Mode quote, people are people, so I can age myself.
So I'll start with the periodization. Now, for me, of course, this is so early, 1850s. I'm an 1880s girl in my heart. But there is a reason beyond just that. So the Napoleonic War has been very well studied. And the veterans of that war, there was actually a little bit more recognition of the traumas of the Napoleonic War and the fears of these veterans. That scholarship is very well done. I'm kind of starting in the 50s because this is the next major reckoning with wars. Not that there were lots of wars happening between Napoleon and this point, but basically, I'm going to have to look at the Crimea too, because literally some of these soldiers were fighting in both. And in their memoirs, they mentioned both. And that might be a very interesting way to distinguish. Does it matter when they're describing killing Russians versus killing Indians? For the memoirs I found, a little bit for sure. But But I think that that's the reason that I was drawn to it, is that this seems like the kind of 50s is a moment where the military was having a reckoning, where there were large numbers of men who were being pulled into war. So it's a good time to start. I originally was going to go to the Boer War, but I think I actually might end before that because so much great work has been done on the Boer War that I'm trying to fill kind of a gap. So the Boer War, the First World War, 20th century, huge scholarship, very well done. The Napoleonic, not too bad. And even before that, so nostalgia, I think the first time it's used is amongst Swiss troops in the 18th century. And then, yeah, the American Civil War stuff is amazing. But I think that because the Brits weren't talking about nostalgia and they didn't have these kind of very self-reflective moments, and there is no major military asylum in the 19th century, scholars have just overlooked it. So I'm always drawn to the overlooked. And as to the dehumanizing and race elements, I think what you find is all that jingoistic, over-the-top nonsense stuff is connected to the trauma stuff, right? It makes it easier to kill a pandy, right, than it does to kill a man. But you also get the sense that in the heart of the battle, it doesn't matter, that, you know, it is this kind of brutal war that you're kind of unleashing this bestial side, and there's this weird actual kind of acceptance. Many memoirs talk about kind of, as much as on the one hand they're saying, oh, the sepoys are terrible and they're brutal, but there's also kind of this real acknowledgement of kind of sameness, of, you know, that they didn't, that they kind of could recognize the horrors that were done to their army because they were doing it to others in ways that maybe people back home couldn't, you know? So like for them, I don't know, it's really interesting the way they talk about it. But I think that the Crimean and mutiny, if I can pull that apart, that's because it's so close together. I think that would really probably be the best evidence whether or not there is a difference when it is an imperial other versus just an enemy of the state for soldiers. Back home, certainly, but I'm curious if in the moment, you know, did it really matter to them?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. The Zulu Wars would be another example where you might see that tension that historians have written a bit about around race and
Yes, I love the stuff about the Zulus because it is such a, like, they love the Zulus. They really kind of think they are proud warriors, but then they'll also say, you know, very racial things in the next sentence. It's this kind of begrudging respect. And with the sepoy troops, of course, often these are men they trained. These are men who are in their regiments wearing British colors. How does that change? And of course, they are supported by Indian troops fighting for the British, right? This is when the Gurkhas really become the kind of valorized regiments of the British. So it's never actually just a white versus Indian conflict either. And you will find sometimes their descriptions of their you'll find that the fellow Indian troops sometimes are described in just as negative, if not sometimes more negative terms than the rebels. So that's really interesting to unpack as well.
excellent, for sure. Yeah. I don't know, was it Freeba or Clayton? Freeba, Clayton hasn't, shall we let Clayton ask his question and then we'll give Freeba's question? I'm not sure who was first.
Mine's short. Actually, Freeba was first, but I'll take it.
Yeah, go first because I already asked the questions.
You had spoken earlier about some of the accounts maybe questioning or shining a negative light on the Imperial Project. I was just hoping that you might be able to shed a bit more light on that. As I've read Richard Price's work, he talked about, you know, uncovering certain accounts of soldiers and stuff that kind of approach the Imperial Project with, you know, the sense of futility after a lot of conflict, and just wanted to see what you're seeing there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends. Obviously, the more senior, frankly, members of the military, the people who have the career military service, high-ranking officials. I think the Imperial Project is perhaps a little less questioned by them. It's hard to find much there. It's more in the diaries or in the one-off just accounts of the rebellion that just seem sometimes to dwell on the horrors and criticizing, if not the Imperial Project in the big sense, in a small sense of like, how did we let this happen? How could we not have avoided this? How did we make these mistakes that led to this? So there are kind of little moments of empathy and breakthroughs. And I'd be very curious. I'm going to, after 2 years delay, going to England this summer to try to look at some more diaries to get a sense of, sometimes I think that diaries in their immediacy are more likely to reveal one-offs, not thought through, right? Not edited, not reflected back upon, just immediate moments. So I'm curious if there are more diaries that might reflect that kind of, if not, there are, as much as the typical narrative of the rebellion is in the very early months, the British public and the British media are sympathetic to the sepoys. And then there's this sea change and everyone in Britain is on side. It's not true. There are some early, very critical histories of the rebellion that say it was a disaster. We shouldn't be in the empire. This was a moment of imperial crisis where we rethought, are we going to do empire or not? And we decided wrong. There's always anti-imperialists. Just because the majority goes one way doesn't mean those voices aren't still there. And I'd be very curious to see if we can find even just echoes of that in diaries. Probably not the memoirs of the generals and the high military brass. I would be very surprised, but you never know.
Yeah, I feel like those would have been probably hidden a bit. They can take that out,
Yeah. But even the fact of, I did find it fascinating, the story, of the commander who shot himself, committed suicide, which according to his troop, obviously we don't have his point of view, but his troops assumed that it was because he was so distraught over not being able to protect his men. That's fascinating. Whether or not that's why he did it, it doesn't matter in a sense. That's how they interpreted it, right? So that's the cultural historian in me that has to be happy with that.
Fariba.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention that I'm looking at the Crimean War and its impact.
Oh no, we lost you again.
By the way, we have been having an awful time with the campus Wi-Fi right now. I think it is cutting in and out. So that's why many of us are leaving and coming back.
As happens. You're muted, Jonathan, but I have to be hardwired at my campus or else the Wi-Fi is just notoriously never works.
Why don't we let Christopher ask while we await Fariba's unfreezing?
I'm sorry to jump in. Thank you so much. And Dr. Milne-Smith, this is such a fabulous talk. I really appreciated how careful you are with using trauma as a floating signifier, as much, which I think is as problematic as PTSD in a lot of ways for different reasons. And I'm just curious to come back to a number of really great questions earlier. The performance versus the descriptive in these memoirs, I think you're really great in how you explore those tensions in the public memoirs. And I'm just wondering about the private memoirs, what they tell us about the performance of whether a neoclassical education of the ferocity of war and the self-control that's necessary that seems to resonate so much. Tom Brown's School Days, right? The kind of classic sport notion of virtue. And I wonder how much of this is actually having to read the trauma or breakdown or PTSD, whatever that signifier is, through these performances, right? The private performances as much as the public ones. And I'm just wondering how difficult that might be, really just following up on some of the questions too. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's what, it took me a while to wrap my head around the kind of Rosenberg approach to the history of medicine, which is something doesn't exist until you name it. But there's something to it, right? In the sense that, as you know, unless, as I always tell my students, unless we invent time travel, some things are just beyond us, right? So all we have is people's language and their ability to express things. And how are they expressing things? They're expressing them through tropes, they're expressing them through stories, through things that will connect to them. You know, he's expressing, like, you know, that we're on a fox hunt, right? I mean, that's telling. That's telling of how am I trying to describe this? And there are moments of absolutely relying on metaphors and descriptors that would be recognizable, not just to audiences, but I think to themselves. I think people are always writing through these things, and they also are not allowing themselves to perhaps explore, experience things in darker ways. I am a soldier, I am a fighter of war. Soldiers are supposed to follow orders and do their duty. And if you are not, the only framework to understand that in is cowardice, right? Is if you are neglecting your duty. I've looked through, I have if anyone's interested, again, my fabulous students transcribed 6,000 court-martial records from the 19th century. And it's so many of those accounts are, you know, absent from post, drunk and on duty, showing cowardice in the face of the enemy, whatever that means. You know, that's how it's understood. And the idea of a man in the heat of battle breaking down in tears, that's the only language they had to understand it. And frankly, even the man who breaks down in tears, that's the only language he has to understand it. Or you will find they talk about, you know, sunstroke, or, you know, something that kind of released these emotions that was beyond my control, that was a somatic cause. And then that's maybe okay. You know, that's kind of the explanation I had. The thing I'm going to carve out as its own project on the military psychiatry and like psychiatry of soldiers really is all about basically making value judgments about who they were as soldiers. And that's the diagnosis you get. A good soldier, your illness is caused by sunstroke, physical ailment, even if it was 20 years ago, that's the cause. Whereas if you are not a good soldier, if you were not a good man, well, then it's intemperance. Then it was you were out of control with drinking or sex or, you know, whatever that wonderfully Victorian term means. And so I think those value judgments are being made not just by authorities, but by the men themselves, because that's, you know, how they express themselves.
Thank you. It's a great project. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I could ask questions all day, but we've kept you for 90 minutes, and that's probably our people are drifting away to other things, and we've really had a great conversation, I think. So thank you all, and thank you in particular, Professor Milne-Smith, for joining us and sharing your research today.
Well, I thank all of you for coming and for indulging me with things I'm still trying to work through. I love presenting work in progress because I think that's when it's best to get feedback. So I really appreciate all of this. So thank you.